Hi guys, welcome to San Sebastian, and welcome to this video, which is video 3 in the series I'm doing about the Mad Dog, the MD-80 from Rotatesim for X-Plane 10. Now before we go any further, I'm just going to mention where we are, and it is significant. This is San Sebastian, Lima Echo Sierra Oscar, which is where the tutorial flight starts from, and it flies from here to Madrid. It's quite a short hop, as a lot of tutorials are, because at the end of the day, when you're doing a tutorial, the important bits are to learn about the systems, the takeoff, the landing, and a small amount of the bit in between, potentially using the FMC and the CDUs, etc. So you've got an idea of using the equipment. However, this is Lima Echo Sierra Oscar San Sebastian, which is freeware. So what the developers have done is they've provided a link in the tutorial documents so that you can download the freeware from X-Plane forums, xplane.org forums. Now they've also provided a link for the freeware for Lima Echo Mike Delta, which is Madrid, which is our destination. So it's very nice that even if you've got X-Plane and you're very new and you haven't really done a great deal with it, it's very nice to be able to just have a couple of airports in relation to the tutorial that will enhance that experience for you with an accurate runway layout, etc. So I'm moving down here for a purpose, and the purpose is that there's a couple of things we're going to look at in the video. The first one is this. Now I'm not going to go through all of it and all of its functions, etc. We are going to discuss it more than anything else. The second thing we're going to look at is this over here, which is the panel on the coaming, the auto flight panel. And then the third and final bit we're going to look at is the actual flight handling, the flight dynamics, so to speak. The CDU, the control display unit, is this fully functional? No. Is it exactly accurate? No. Is it a study sim element? No. You know, all these questions are asked quite frequently on the forums, and I think, if anything, the one criticism I would give at this point of Rotatesim is management of expectations. It's quite clear that a lot of the community weren't sure what to expect with this aircraft, and I appreciate that developers, to a greater or lesser extent, will, you know, be guarded and deliberately guarded over the features of their product, because sometimes it's just not possible to do it. So rather than promise something they then can't deliver, you know, from my perspective, it's quite acceptable for developers to be not coy, but certainly to be guarded about promising something they can't deliver. So Rotatesim, for example, have said this is highly detailed, and it is when you look at the interior, exterior modelling, etc. You know, the detail of the dust and fingerprints on the screen and the wear and tear around this. It is highly detailed. However, it is not a study sim level CDU stroke flight management system. Likewise, it is not a study level overhead panel. Likewise, it is not a study level autopilot, and there are limitations. So probably the easiest thing to do to demonstrate some of the limitations of the systems is going to be to do the first part of the tutorial flight, and you'll see where I'm coming from. So the first part of the issue now is, how do we turn the ground power on? Now the ground power is activated through the FMS, and if we turn the battery on, which is up here, there we go, the battery switch isn't the easiest thing to see there. You can see that there's nothing I can do to turn these on. The screens are dead. So I would need either APU or ground power. So how do I turn that on? There is a workaround, which is to go to the emergency power. Then you go back down to here. And what we'll do is we will just turn the ground power on first. So index aircraft management. We'll put that to weight in pounds, and we'll turn the ground power unit on. Then we can go back up here, and you can see these lights come on, so it's available. Turn it on, and then what we can do is turn that off, and now we've got ground power established. And this is one of the things, is that ideally that's not how you would do it. And one of the things actually I would say at this point is there is a lack of 2D panels. And I'm not on about having a 2D cockpit. What I'm on about is the fact that in terms of 2D panels, it's nice to be able to click on the CDU and to have a version of it up here that you can manipulate while still maintaining your view. And the classic examples of that would be for spatial orientation when doing a takeoff or landing in poor visibilities, because normally in a two-crew environment you would be able to multitask and share the workload. Obviously, we're single crew, we can't do that. However, you know, there's a concession there to the fact that we are single crew. The two CDUs, for example, are not, you can see that they're not independent, they're cross-linked, so whatever you do here is mimicked over here. Now again, as a single pilot, for me that's not a biggie. I know for some who are doing you know, a lot of stuff, that will be a biggie. However, there's every possibility that in terms of Smart Copilot, which is an add-on or a plugin you can get, I should say, for X-Plane, there's every chance that a profile will be written that would enable you to do that. So have a multi-crew cockpit, which means it's a bit more awkward in terms of only one of you being able to do anything with a CDU at one time and programming the FMC. However, you know, I think it's understandable. One of the elements that is a key thing here is that the developers have decided that they're going to look at the possibility of some 2K textures, because this is one of the first aircraft I've encountered with P3D where it really does start to hammer the VAS, the virtual address space. So they're conscious of that. A very, very small number of people have had issues with their FPS, their frames per second, so the developers are in effect listening to that. So probably the best way now to demonstrate some of the limitations is going to be to program this. Now, before we go any further, this is the ident page. This is the first page that you get up on virtually any FMS, and it's got its nav data cycle. The first thing you'll see is that this is a current nav data cycle. It does do SIDS and stars. You can update the nav data, and it uses the Aerosoft Airbus X nav data profile. However, at the moment, Nav Data Pro and Navigraph don't seem to recognise this aircraft for me, so what I have to do is use another means of downloading that profile to another aircraft, for example, or having it downloaded and finding the path for it. But what I've been doing is I've just been copying and pasting the actual nav data from an Aerosoft Airbus X profile aircraft. Doesn't have to be the Airbus, it just has to be another aircraft that uses that that nav data format, and just cut and paste it and drop it in the nav data folder for this, and it works fine, up to the point where hopefully I can find another workaround. But that's the way I'm having to do it at the minute. It does work perfectly fine, it's not an issue, and as you can see it does produce an up-to-date AirRack. However, that has caused an issue in its own right, because the AirRack that ships with the aircraft is something like 2014, I think. Now, when you go through the tutorial, I did the tutorial route just to test it with the with all the aircraft standard, and it went through it perfectly. Once I'd updated the AirRack, I had a bit of an issue, and that's because the original flight plan comes down an airway, Uniform November 857, and it goes to an intersection called Banvo, B-A-N-V-O. That doesn't exist anymore. So when I've done searches on the internet, when I've looked at the various charts and done searches through SkyVector, etc., that doesn't exist. So of course the CDU, when you're trying to program the tutorial route, comes up saying that the waypoint is not on the airway or not on the flight plan. I can't remember exactly how it words it. So that causes a little bit of confusion, and then you have to sort of figure out a way around it. So what I've done is I've got SkyVector and I've slightly amended the flight plan. Of course, the other addition to that is because that is the start point for the star, that means that the star is redundant, and so now I'm doing the BAN 3 Bravo, and that is in relation to a VOR. There's a VOR beacon, which is the start of the star with the tag-on, T-A-G-O-M transition. So it can be fixed. What I'll probably do is I'll leave the route in the description so that if you're having issues whatever, you can update it. So the ident page is exactly as you'd expect normally. The POS in it is pretty much as you would expect. So we're going from LISO, Lima Echo Sierra Oscar, which is San Sebastian, comes up with our positions. Now this has got a speed IRS alignment, so you go up here, put it to nav, come back down here, and you get your little blank boxes. I always take the GPS position because GPS is where the aircraft's at. How the reference airport is exactly that, it's a reference position. Every airport has a single point on the airfield which they use for reference, and it's normally a pointer or marker which will be somewhere around the middle. Quite often with single runway airports it's actually in line with the centre point of the runway. which is obviously not where we're up at when we're setting up an inertial reference system. So I always use the GPS position. And you can see it set it nicely, and what will happen now is the screens come up accordingly. Now in terms of this, normally for the POS init page you would have another couple of pages, so you'd have one of two or one of three up here, because you'd then be able to go on to the individual nav systems, the GPS and the IRS, to see the alignment and the comparison between the different systems. Because airliners have multiple systems, this is making the assumption that the GPS is never going to fail, and that the IRS matches the GPS perfectly and is never going to drift. However, for the average home simmer, that's not an issue. So the route, we're going to Madrid, Lima, Echo, Mike Delta, which is fine. You can put a company route in. When I've tried to put a company route in before, it's been absolutely fine. So what you can do is, if you go through this, you can go to menu, you can save the route that you've put into here, and then you can basically go through the process of, if you want to reload it, you just go through the company route and you just put in the title of what you've named it. So we're not going to bother with most of it. To Lizo. So what we're going to do now is I'll do the departure and arrival. So the departure from Lizo, going for runway 04, and let me just have a quick look at my list. We're going to PPM1 Bravo, no transition. We'll execute that, and then we'll go to the route, next page. So from there we're going Upper November, or Uniform November I should say, 857, and we're going to Vassum with that, V-A-S-U-M, and then from there we're going Upper November 857 again, Uniform November 857, and that's going to take us all the way to Bravo Alpha November, which is a VOR, and then from there we're going to do our star. So execute that, arrival, Lima Echo Mike Delta. It's going to be the BAN 3B, and we're going for the ILS 18 left Yankee, and it's the tag-on transition. Execute. Boom, done. So that's all our routes sorted. Let's have a quick look. It does come up with discontinuities. Now I said this in a previous video. What basically happens is when you get to the stars particularly, you get to your final fix, and then it puts the star in terms of the initial part of the star fine. As soon as you put the transition in, you get discontinuity. So what we can do is we can just delete that, and then what happens is you get your transition, and if we go to the next page, you'll find it's put a discontinuity between the transition and the actual approach. So again, all we do is we get rid of that, and then that's fine. That's all ready to go. Now that's pretty much the route sorted. It's not 100% compared to say a PMDG aircraft, but that's fine. Now one of the things here is the fuel, and all of the details here. A lot of them can be self-populated, so the fuel, we've got loads, zero fuel weight, fine. Cost index, now that is an issue with this. The cost index for an aircraft is incredibly hard to work out mathematically. And one of the things that's become apparent is the developers of this haven't had access to real-life cost index. Now the cost index for aircraft comes in two formats. I think one's called Smith's, and I can't remember what the other one's called. But nonetheless, one of them has a 2-digit cost index that goes from 0 to 99, and the other one has a 3-digit cost index that goes from 0 to 999. It is not a linear scale, so you will find that even if aircraft can go 0 to 999, some of them will only have a cost index of 25 or maybe 30, 50, whatever it is. It's not a linear scale. Now it's a combination of, in effect, the efficiency that you want from the aircraft and the speed, and it offsets the two. Given the aerodynamics of an aircraft, the fuel cost, the distance, the altitudes you might fly at as a company, a lot of these the companies actually write off to or send information off to the aircraft manufacturers, and they say what are the cost indexes to achieve X, Y, and Z. Now, as I say, the developers haven't had access to real-life MD-80, MD-88 figures. So what they've done is they've got a linear scale, which in effect goes from 0 to 999. Now, of course, that means that your cost index here for a decent airspeed will be much higher than the reality. So the reality for a decent airspeed, you might only have to put 25 in, but we're going to put 500. And that will give us a decent airspeed. So the cruise altitude we're going to is 260. And you see that one of the things we get is in a real one you'd be able to put in 260. We can't. The next thing to highlight is the fact that normally with an aircraft you press and hold clear, and it would clear the whole line. We have to do it individually. Now these are very, very, very minor things. We can put in flight level 260, and that goes in. Now some people have had issues in terms of the transition altitudes, etc. Our transition altitude will put in 10,000. So, and it puts it as flight level 100. So takeoff page, let's execute all of that before we go any further. Outside air temperature is 15, nice sunny day. I've got, I can't remember actually if I've got real world weather done. Now, another element of the sim that is somewhat restricting the V speeds, V1, VR, V2, they automatically set the bugs, which is great. However, the issue is that the V speeds are dependent on the flap position. So whatever flap position is in, it will give you the V speeds. So actually what we'll do is we'll put the V speeds in. And that is in effect the V speeds for a 0 flap takeoff, and you can see V2 147 but VR 138. Now, San Sebastian is not a very long runway, so if you're using those as V speeds, the first thing you'll find is the aircraft wants to lift off much earlier than you're anticipating. Because in effect your aircraft calculations are incorrect for the speeds, so you'll be roaring along towards V1 and VR, and the aircraft will probably want to get airborne far before you're expecting it to. The second thing is that obviously with regards to that, you have the risk that if you don't let it fly you'll run out of runway, which is obviously not a good thing. But in effect that's the FMS setup at the moment, so we'll execute that, put it in, and then what you'll find is our bugs are set. Okay, so all good and done, all good and dandy. So now the next bit to look at is this bit over here, which is our auto flight system, and it's not the most straightforward of systems. It has got quite a high level of modelling compared to the real thing. It is not 100% accurate. So for example, when you do a takeoff mode, you would do these are your enunciators over here. You'd have EPA takeoff, you'd have your alt pre-select here, which is orange. You'd have two takeoff sections here, and then as you take off, I think it's if you've had the takeoff power set above 60% for more than 20 seconds, you get a message which says clamp here, and basically what it's saying is it's going to maintain that power setting for you until you tell it to do something else. So it's one of those things where it's not 100% accurate, but actually the modes they've modelled are the ones you're going to use, really, I think is the best way of looking at it. You know, it's got the lateral modes of heading hold, VNAV, FMS in terms of the interoperability with that, but yeah, it's not bad. As I say, it's not 100% accurate, but then there's quite a few of the modes that I suspect would have been very difficult to implement. So your flight directors here does the usual little magenta cross there. At the moment we've got EPA takeoff. I'm not quite sure what's gone on there in terms of, I must have clicked some buttons previously. However, let's look at the actual panel. The actual panel is an ergonomic nightmare. So you've got nav1 over here, nav2, which is fine. You know, there's no issues with that. You've got a nice array of little black buttons hidden in amongst each other, but the way it's laid out isn't ideal. These are your auto throttle settings on the left, basically. So you can tell the auto throttle you want speed select, max select to hold those two. EPA limit is you want the throttle to respond to a power setting, which is a combination of this and the FMS. And then you can set it for FMS override. So rather than accepting the speed that the FMS has derived, you click that and then you just dial your speed here. All is good. Bizarre thing is the way things wrap around. So these are your lateral modes, but they're wrapped around the auto throttle, which is very bizarre. These are your vertical modes, and they're wrapped around your autopilot. They're next to your altitude window, which is good, and they're next to the vertical speed, which is good. But it's kind of odd having them in the middle between the two in some respects, because in the same window here, look, you've got your heading and your vertical speed, which is, the whole thing for me is a little bit jumbled up. So in terms of the system, one of the things you find initially as you get to learn the aircraft, and I'm still doing it, is you'll get to 500 feet and you go, right, I want to plug in VNAV and LNAV, or VNAV and FMS, and you'll hunt for the buttons because it's not immediately apparent. They kind of blend in. There's no differentiation other than the text that, you know, what does where. So I suppose it's just practice more than anything else. But if you're setting this thing up for a takeoff now, we're doing it slightly different to the tutorial, so we'll dial in 205 here, which is the speed constraint for the first turn. At this point I'm going to mention the EPA limits, so put that on, make sure that's on takeoff. So on takeoff, where you get EPA takeoff, it sets a takeoff power setting, which when the FMS is fully set up, you'll see as little yellow markers. So let me just see if it's going to show it with this. Let me go to takeoff flex. Yeah, you can see I can change the markers with the takeoff flex there. However, what we want for our takeoff is the takeoff setting. So once we've got our takeoff power set and all of this set up and all of our FMS set, you get a little yellow bug, and the EPA will go to that power and stay at that power after you've put your auto throttle on. So the element here is that your EPA limit is a power setting based on your stage of flight, and the stage of flight is selected by this. If you don't select it, it won't do anything automatically, and it's very easy to overspeed. If you get to your thrust reduction altitude and you're still on takeoff and EPA limit, it will not reduce the power because it assumes you're still trying to take off even though you're not. So you need to move on from EPA limit. You either need to get into a speed mode, or you need to do an FMS override. And the other thing obviously is you need to adjust your power. So all of these things will affect your speed in one way, shape or form or another, and you need to sort of get to grips with it, I guess is the best way of describing it. So over here you would look at your lateral modes. As I say, wrap around the auto throttler next to the speed window, which is a bit bizarre. The inner dial, or the inner column I should say, is for your bank angle. This thing banks horrendously, so on the it banks quite steeply. So on the tutorial they do recommend you turn it down a couple of clicks to about 15 degrees. The other thing on the tutorial is that they suggest a climb out heading for heading mode of 41 degrees, and you just push this little. It's odd. You push it by pulling the mouse. Very odd, but it doesn't make a blind bit of difference really. Now I've set 4,000 feet because our first constraint altitude for the SID is 4,000 feet. Click on the knob and that does your altitude pre-select, which you can see is in a different colour here. And then the final thing is we're actually going to climb out using vertical speed. You could climb out using VNAV. Won't do anything at the moment because the VNAV isn't set up in the flight plan fully at the minute. However, we're going to use vertical speed. Going to dial it to 2,500. And that'll get us off the ground nicely and heading away from the dangerous earthy stuff. So really that's all there is to in terms of setting it up. In terms of operating it, it's actually not too bad. The lateral modes are pretty much what you'd expect, fairly standard for most auto flight systems. The vertical modes, it does include these two. Alt hold is just literally press a button and it will hold that altitude. VNAV is exactly what it says on the tin. However, the indicated airspeed and vertical speed what it says on the tin, but the indicated airspeed Mac uses pitch, to the best of my knowledge, to control your speed, which is interesting in an airliner like this. You don't often get it in airliners, but you do get it here. So in that respect, what you could do is you could set a power setting with your EPA limit, and then you can control your indicated airspeed. So if I click that, you can see it's got speed 180, indicated airspeed down here, and that means the pitch will control the indicated airspeed, which is rather an odd state of affairs in many respects. We'll go back to vertical speed because that makes more sense in this climb out. It's rather an odd state of affairs, and I doubt if I would use it particularly, but as I say, slightly interesting auto flight system. I found it took a little bit of effort to work it, purely out of the fact that it does appear very different to those which are on Boeings and particularly Airbuses. Airbuses, I don't know what the plural of that is. It is one of those things that you start to get used to. It's not a particularly difficult thing, it just looks a bit funny and the buttons are a bit hard to find at times, but that's the real aircraft. You know, the next element, I suppose, is at what level this has been modelled in terms of accuracy. Now, some of the modes are missing, so your pre-takeoff modes that you would normally expect to see in the real thing, you'd have EPA takeoff just as this, you'd have the alt just as this, then you'd normally have two takeoff annunciations here. When you get to, I think it's 20 seconds at more than 60% power, this one actually changes to CLMP, clamp, and basically what it means is it's set the throttles and it's not going to mess around with them. However, what you then need to do as soon as you can after takeoff, you need to make sure that it goes into EPA climb, which is your climb power setting. As I say, it's very easy to overspeed, so if you don't take it out of EPR takeoff, then you will overspeed, because that is just literally a power setting. It's telling the engines, give me everything you've got, and give me everything you've got until you change mode. So if you level out and that's still set, you're going to go roaring off to a great speed. It's one of those things you get used to. I actually quite like it. I think it's a nice sort of very interesting system to use. It does take a little bit of getting used to, as I say, with the buttons, but that's one of the challenges of flight simming. That's the whole reason we do it, is to fly lots of different aircraft that we wouldn't otherwise get the opportunity to do so. So that's your auto flight system. It's modelled. I can't give you, if you like, the amount of it that's modelled. What I can say is that from the documents I've read, the modes seem to be, most of them seem to be supported, and the enunciations seem to match that. There's the odd bit like the clamp that's not included, but generally speaking, the control of speed when it goes into FMS speed mode down here, and all of your various modes, apart from those that are missing, which I don't think we'd generally use, actually it's not too bad. It's pretty good, which is saying something, because some of the modes are basically based on, they're either a custom mode, the vertical mode I think is custom, or it's a modified mode of I think the lateral mode. The navigation mode is a modified, significantly modified version of what's in X-Plane, which is to no detriment. If you can get it to work and you can get it to do what you want to do, then why not do it? That's the way I see it. So that's looking at the auto flight system, and let's move on now. As I say, this is not a study sim. So let's get the fuel on, start the APU. And away we go, it's started. So we'll just wait for that to power up. In the meantime, one of the things we should have done is we should have gone over here, should have put our nav lights on. So what I'll do is I'll get it all fired up and I shall see you in a moment. So as we're starting here, a very quick test in terms of the engine system's fidelity. What we're going to do is we're going to try and overtemp the engine and see what happens. So let's get rid of that one, get rid of that one, open the guard for that start and turn that start on. Now, of course, it starts very slowly. The normal N2 for introducing fuel is 24%. So what we're going to do is we're going to introduce it now and see what happens. And there we go. It does go into an overtemp condition. However, I don't know about you, I don't hear any warnings. I don't hear any alarm bells going off. So it went over into the red, but I've got no annunciations to tell me that anything's gone wrong. So in terms of simulating it, the needles do simulate it, but the actual aircraft doesn't have any repercussions as a result. Not that I'm aware of. I can't see anything. There appears to be no issues regarding it. So again, you know, there are limitations to this. We've now got a perfectly running engine, despite the fact that we did overtemp it by chucking loads of fuel in when the RPM was too low. And likewise, there is the other option, that the potential thing that could have been simulated was a hung start. But we got neither, so it's one of the limitations of the sim. For me personally, I think it depends on what level this is aimed at, and I think if it's aimed at the, shall we say, the person who's not looking for the high fidelity sim, it could be intensely frustrating. Any of those who have used the PMDG Jetstream 4100 will know how infuriating it can be for the first few goes while you're trying not to burn your engines out as you learn the systems. This is more accessible because in effect what's not going to happen is you're not going to destroy the aircraft before you even get off the ground. However, for the purists amongst everyone, the element is that it is what it is. One of the things I haven't yet done is I haven't got rid of ground power, so aircraft management, let's get rid of the GPU. GPU's away, index, back to takeoff page now. We've got hydraulics on, so with hydraulics on what we're going to do now is we're going to set the flaps. Take it to 3 positions, use our little spinny wheel here, 15 degrees flat should give us 10 units of trim. That's a warning noise, by the way, that is in the real aircraft, designed to remind the pilots, or at least tell the pilots, that their trim is working and their trim system's active. I can see it being really useful, but I can also see it's really annoying, and I think after a certain amount of hours in the air with this thing, you'd probably get to the point where you sat there going, you'd start to not notice it, shall we say. So we can get rid of that. The ground power is off. The APU, let's get rid of that. We can put the air on for the minute. I'm not going through the checklist because at the moment the purpose of this is not to go through the checklist, but is really to go through the process of just getting the aircraft in the air. And as you can see, in some respects the checklists aren't desperately important, because I can go through the process of doing what I need to do, and I can get it in the air without too much difficulty. One of the things we should have done. Now, this highlights an area where it's sometimes a little bit frustrating. The click spots are not on the bottom of the switches. So if I try and put the anti-collision light on, it's the floodlights that come on, even though I'm clicking at the bottom of the anti-collision light. So I have to click almost over the strobe light, the position strobe light switch here, to get the anti-collisions to come on. Not a massive issue, just one of those things that becomes you become used to with the aircraft. However, you know, for some people that might be significant. I don't know. For me, it's not. We'll just extend the wing landing lights, but we're not going to put them on. So what I'll do is I'll taxi out. We'll get to the threshold of 0.4, and then we'll see how we get on. Now, taxiing this aircraft, FSX and P3D for me, depending on the aircraft developers and designers. Let's just check the brakes. We're good to go. The other thing we need to do is we need to go down here, and this is why the 2D views are quite critical. Reset, and you can see 147 to 134. That's a big change for that. So ATPL, let's make sure the transponder's on. Autopilot set, transponders on, pitot heat is on, and landing lights are just about ready to go. Not my best taxiing, but there we go. This is quite a narrow runway. Now, one of the things I would say is that it's quite a common factor with X-Plane. The ground handling of most aircraft is very good, and you don't end up with this lurching effect that you often get with FSX and P3D aircraft. This thing is much nicer to drive on the ground than a lot of those aircraft, and in fact I think that's a common trait that I've found with X-Plane, because it doesn't have the ground braking bug. You know, I'm at a very low power setting, EPA of 1.21, 1.22, nice and easy to taxi. It's a really, that's idle, that's just a little bit above idle really. Just managed to flick a switch on my Thrustmaster throttle quadrant. Fortunately it wasn't bound to anything. There's a little turning circle down here. For those of you who've got two throttles, it's not too bad, but it's got a very odd behaviour if you have not enough power and too much of the nose wheel turned in. So we'll have to put quite a bit of left-hand power, and if I use the left brake, now I'm just going to check it compared to previous. There you go. You see it suddenly stops if you haven't quite got the momentum around the corner. It doesn't slow down slowly. It just suddenly stops. Right. Just going to get the nose slightly off centre. Press the left hand brake, press the right hand brake. Differential braking doesn't appear to be modelled for me. So again, press the left hand brake, nothing happens. Press the right hand brake. Oh, it is. It's very slowly, but it's not significant. But there we go. We've still got the standard altitude set. I'm not interested in that. One of the elements is that TCAS is not modelled. For those who fly in virtual airlines, that may well be an issue. It depends on the virtual airline. We're not lined up straight, but I'm not going to have kittens over that. So a quick couple of bits about the FMS. You can see here we're on the legs page at the moment. Now, in terms of constraints, you can see that it's got one constraint from the SID. Now, this particular SID has a couple of constraints, one of which is a speed limit of 205 knots for the first initial turn, so Sierra Sierra November 7. And then the second constraint is to be at this point at 4,000 feet. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a couple of the constraints in. Now, there's a significant bit to this, and I shall demonstrate it. The The constraints are only adjustable during the SID, the transition, and then the star transition and the arrival. So for the main route, they're not adjustable. So if I come into here, for example, VASM, let's say I wanted to do 250 because we're well above our transition altitude there. If I try and put that in, it says invalid entry. So the only way I can change speed in regards to the FMS is to go into menu, perf, and change the cost index. Now doing that is a bit of a ham-fisted way of doing it, to be honest, which is not one that I would prefer to be doing. Second thing to be aware of, you notice here it's duplicated these two waypoints. That's because this was the first part of our flight plan and this is the last waypoint of our SID. So it's duplicated them, and it's not really figured out why, although I'm intrigued as to why there's a 25-degree difference between the two. However, if I delete this one is the end one of the SID, and it then no longer recognises the SID. I need to delete the one that's not in the SID, which in this case will be the second of the two. So just something to be wary of, that if you delete, for example, if you're in your SID and you delete a point here, the chances are your SID will not then work. So let's just double check. It's one of the other things I don't like is the fact that in normal FMSs you can cycle round, so you can go from page 4 to 1. However, right, let's put in our other constraint, 205 at 4,000, and this is an altitude constraint that needs to go there. So what we can now do is we can now say that our altitude constraint is set there, and all is good. So as you see, there are elements in the FMS that aren't entirely accurate to what we would want. Strange goings on, like you get to this page and you can't go to init.ref, but if you go to the menu, you can then go to pos init and go to init.ref. So very strange, very strange. And this is one of the things I'm saying is that you do get some odd behaviours, and it's difficult to explain why. None of them are crucial, none of them really destroy the sim, so to speak. However, another thing to be aware of is if you haven't got a speed restriction, the FMS goes for this. So you see we've got a speed restriction here to 205 Sierra November 7. That overrules a lot of the other stuff. So once you're past this speed restriction, it goes roaring off into the distance, and that's one of the considerations, because in effect what this now does is this overrides the 250 to flight level 100 speed restriction. Very bizarre. However, it's something that's manageable. It just needs a little bit of an awareness of it, because otherwise what happens, you see the speed restrictions come into the descent path as well here, which it shouldn't be doing. So yeah, there are elements where if you start to put in restrictions, it's not 100% accurate what it's trying to do. Menu, takeoff, back to here. So we've got all the figures in and we're ready to go. So here we go then, on the toe brakes, get ourselves to an engine power, it's stabilising, auto throttle goes on. Now this thing accelerates slowly, it's a bit of a ground gripper to start with. Once it gets going you'll see it gets a very nose-high pitch, nose-high deck angle. If you see them flying out of LaGuardia on videos or whatever, you'll see what I mean. Second thing is, it's got this odd behaviour where you pitch up and then it kind of stops and you need to sort of pitch up again. So what will happen is V1, rotate, as we lift the nose you'll see it, watch it, I've not changed my control inputs, and then off it goes again. So let's get the gear up and we'll try and follow the magenta lines. Now at 500 feet I'm going to engage LNAV, and where's it gone? LNAV and vertical speed, autopilot going on. Now the reason why I've done that is that, in fact what we'll do at the moment, we'll just do a couple of things. Need to change this to climb. There we go, climb power, EPR climb, nav track, vertical speed. Now one of the key reasons why I've done that is because this thing trades airspeed for height, or sorry, height for airspeed. So if I now go to VNAV I should be okay, but if you do it too low to the ground, what happens is you see it pitches down so that it can then attain the required speed it wants, and it pitches down a lot, look. So we actually went into a descent because it wanted to accelerate to 205 knots. Now I do not know if that's what the real aircraft does. However, it strikes me that if you get to 500 feet, you can't just plug in VNav, because you may well end up stuffing straight into the ground. Whilst I'm talking, I've omitted to do my flaps. However, we weren't past the limiting speed, so we should be alright. Now obviously the first things we're looking for now is does it follow the constraint in terms of speed here, which is 205, and does it follow the constraint of altitude, which is 4,000 feet. We've had our warning, and we can see here now FMS speed, nav track, VNav climb. So all is looking promising. You can hear the throttles winding back, and all at the moment appears to be quite good. What we can do is we can take our nose lights off as well, seeing as the gear is up. That's got rid of. Then we can get rid of that. Deep joy. What we will do while it's sorting that out, we will do our after takeoff checks. So after takeoff, landing gear up, lights out, engine igniters are as required, we'll leave them on. Bank angle 25 to 30 we've got set. ART switch auto, flap slat lever up and retracted, auto brakes are off, TRPs climb. Hide and aux transfer pumps are off. I'll do that now. These two here. And then the last couple, centre fuel tank pump as required. Well, we haven't actually got to do anything with that. It's pretty much automatic at the minute. You can see that the centre tank's pump fuel figure is coming down. The other two are okay. Altimeters 1013, which we've got after takeoff checklist, is complete. Now, I'm not going to mess around with this too much now. The constraint now at SSN is to be above 5,500, so what we can do is we can put it to a suitable altitude and this thing will just climb. I'm going to put it up to 10,000 for a reason, and we'll wait for it to climb up. Now you can see again we've got FMS EPA to show it's in a climb mode. Altitude is pre-selected, nav track, VNav climb. So away we go. What we're actually going to do, we're going to get up to 10,000 feet, we're going to do a bit of general handling over the Pamplona, over towards the Pamplona area. You can see the high ground here, and this is the combination of the default. In fact, I think it might even be the default mesh for X-Plane 10, but it does look nice. Look at that. It's hard not to be impressed with that, really, isn't it? Really nice. That's where we've departed from, down there, look. Really nice around these parts of the world. I must admit, it does do mountainous areas really, really well. Okay, now we've not passed Sierra November yet. However, you can see that because we passed our previous waypoint, which had the speed restriction of 205, what the thing does is it tries to get to the next speed as quick as it can. So, in effect, even if this is constraint of 250, at the previous waypoint it passed, it will just accelerate as quick as it can towards 250. That's all it does. It gets a little bit excitable, really. I'll bring the bank angle's alright. The bank angle in this thing can get ridiculous with the autopilot, so even in the checklist it does say you need to bring it down to about 15 degrees for the climb out in the initial part of the checklist. What we'll do at this point is we'll pop it into FMS override. Now here we go, here's the speed element again. Look, instead of just using the auto throttle, it pitches up. It pitches up markedly. Our rate of climb there got to 4,000 feet a minute, and that's patently not what this thing would do normally. You know, there's no way that when you go into FMS override it would pitch up for 4,000 feet a minute rate of climb to try and lead off the speed. This thing's also very slippy in a descent, that's worth being aware of. Now what we are going to do now is we're actually going to prepare ourselves for a return, and we're going to come back towards the airfield, and we're going to replace that. So we're going to go to departure arrival, and we're going to go to arrival, and we're going to delete all of that because we're no longer going there. We're going to execute that, then we're going to go to route, and instead of that we're going to go back to LESO. There's no point flying in our route here. Pop that in there, execute, depart, arrive. We're going to go for a runway 22 SSN, execute. As you've seen, what we've got is a kind of, I think the way to describe it is a modified, an adapted FMS. It does have a relatively good level of functionality for the normal user. If you're into your ultra high fidelity systems, then it's not going to meet your criteria However, if you want something that's just straightforward fun to fly, then actually it's not a bad system. You can see we can reprogram waypoints in it, you can see that we can adjust the course and track, you can see that we can check it, you can see that we can do SIDS and stars. The only things to be wary of is there are a few little tricks. This thing loves to mess you around with the speed with these modes here. Now these modes here are purely in relation to the speed. They have nothing to do with the profile of the climbs and the descents. You've also seen that the speed, for whatever reason, the autopilot takes precedence with speed over your vertical profile. So if you're at 500 feet and you're slow, let's say and I've had this happen to me once where I came out at V2 plus 10, and I do wonder why in the instructions it says speed of 250 and whatnot for the departure, but I've climbed out at V2 plus 10, and as soon as I tried to then put it into the normal speed mode, at 500 feet, it shoved the nose right at the ground, and it was one of those things where you want to take avoiding action. So what we can see actually is what it's done is it's flown to the next waypoint. Now it hasn't deleted anything we've flown over, so it looks a bit scary down here, and it's flown to the next waypoint even though we put Sierra Sierra November in before, and now it's ignoring all of this on the EFIS, and it's actually routing as per the FMC. So it's an interesting anomaly that in effect what happens is it hasn't updated the magenta line. We know it's not flying to these points because they're not highlighted magenta, they're highlighted white. So it's a bit of a strange situation really to look at when you look at this. However, we can be fairly certain it's gone into the FMC appropriately at the moment. Now what we're going to do, instead of doing all that, I'm going to take it out of autopilot. In fact, before I do that, let's dial up some beacons. 119.7. Let's do that was our first one. 117.9, sorry. Interesting little glitch with this. I'll show it if you look at the digits counting down. 111, 12, 11, 10, 19. I didn't do it. Let's see if we'll do it this time. Oh well, didn't do it. I've previously had occasions where it goes 112, 111, 112, 111, even if you're reducing, so very bizarre. Mind you, that's flight simming. We get this a lot of the time with a lot of flight sims. Inbound course for that's 215. What we're going to do whilst we're here actually is we'll just descend down to about 8,000. Vertical speed down about 1200. Make sure we click the altitude button to have the altitude set. Speed select 205. Bring that down a bit as well to 200. Coming back towards Sierra Sierra Delta, or Sierra Sierra November, sorry. And then over here we're going to put up 114.15. Want that radial to be 270. We're going to use that to gauge our VOR approach. Okay, so that's all set up. Make sure those are both on nav, and they are, and they're both indicating, which is fine. So what are we going to do now? Well, we're going to do a bit of general handling. So we're going to take all of the automatics out and see what we think of the flying of the plane as a whole. So first thing we're going to get rid of
landing gear.
That. We're going to get rid of that. I'm going to press that. Now the landing gear warning is basically similar to general aviation, where it thinks you're going to be in a landing situation, i.e. low power setting, descent, etc. It warns you if your speed is too low because it thinks, well, you're trying to land and you haven't got your gear down. Very similar to your average general aviation. Okay, so trim. Trimmer is very powerful. Very easy to overcompensate with trim. It does stabilise out, however. In terms of control harmony, there's some good and some bad. The roll is nice. It's not crisp, but you can control it very nicely. It's not particularly quick either, but it's a little bit, you know. And I think when we looked at the controls earlier, these are not hydraulically powered controls. These are a collection of levers and pulleys. So although they're probably fairly direct in the real thing, I would have thought there's lots of feedback. It's not as sprightly as some of the other add-on aircraft that are out there, but it is very nice and very controllable. So I can, if I go over here, look, I can set it back to pretty much level. Just a little bit of a check as you do so. In fact, I don't really need much of a check at all. As soon as I let go, it stabilises. Now, let's get the power off because we're speeding up too much here. It is a slippery plane, by the way, guys. So it's something to be aware of. Okay. In terms of stability in the turn, whether it demonstrates any particular want to level out, we'll go outside. Now the first thing you can see is it's got some dihedral, which tries to level the wings, but it's also got swept wing, which gives it positive stability generally as a type for what we're doing. And I guess you can see it's gradually starting to level the wings. It's nothing too exciting, but it is doing it, so it does have positive stability in that plane. Again, this thing is very slippery. It's quite hard to slow down, and it doesn't need a lot of power either on the approach or in a descent. It's very slippery, and on occasions you do find yourself using a lot of speed brake. Having said that, I don't know what the real thing's like. You know, we're not all fortunate to have flown a dozen different types of commercial airliners, much as it would be nice, so we are somewhat in the lap of the gods of making sure that the developers have spoken to the right people to make sure it does exactly what it says on the tin. So we're just going to come back round. As we come back round, we'll get a bit more altitude because we are over some nasty looking cliffs. Okay, speed stability and pitch stability. They're both interlinked. So what we can do is we can level ourselves out. We'll try and get level, there or thereabouts. Altitude's irrelevant as to what we're levelling at. It's more the behaviour of the aircraft. Okay, so we're not far off trimmed there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to disturb it and we'll see what happens in terms of behaviour. So there we go. Let's put the nose up, and I would expect speed will drop. As speed drops, the centre of lift changes compared to the moment in relation to the centre of lift, and the centre of gravity changes, and the nose should drop. And we can see it is starting to drop there, look. As it drops, let's just level the wings, so there's no elevator input there. As it drops, what then should happen is the speed should increase. And the speed should increase up to the point where the lift overpowers the pitching forces again, and the nose starts to lift up. Hopefully we'll do it just before we crash into something. But there we go. You can see the speed's increasing, but now the nose is pitching up. What will happen now is the speed stops increasing and starts to reduce, and then the nose will drop again. You can see our speed's just coming to a halt, and now it's coming down again. And our nose is still climbing, but what will happen shortly is the nose will stop climbing as the speed drops to its bottom element. So yeah, it's there or thereabouts. It's not bad actually. Now here's my concern. Let's just get ourselves pointed back down towards where we're going. It is fairly sporty in terms of its handling. It's nice. You can put it in a 60-degree angle of bank turn. Quite nice. Look. And yes, that's within the criteria available for a flapless flight. These aircraft should be certified without flaps to 2.5G, plus 2.5G. So a 60-degree angle of bank turn is not something that the aircraft is not capable of. Okay, so let's keep ourselves going back round to here. Going back in the rough general direction of where we go. We're 25 miles from the Sierra November, so we've obviously covered quite a bit of ground whilst we've been nattering. Okay, so that's that element of it. Now here's the element that I'm, shall we say, not so happy with. The yaw response is quite nice. It's a bit woolly. This is a power assisted control in this aircraft. It's the only one of the three primary controls that is power assisted, but it's very woolly. But what you can see is we do get the secondary effect of roll with it, and there it goes. And here's my issue. That was a small yaw input, so let's put a slightly bigger one. This is going to be about half deflection. Look at that. Let's cover it with roll, with rudder, sorry, not roll. It takes a little bit of wallow to get used to it. We are at quite a high speed, so I'd expect the control inputs to be really quite direct, and they are, but holy heck, for an airliner, that rudder response. Should we do it again, see if we don't crash? Let's have a go. Full rudder. Holy crap, that's not good. Whoa, 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 calm. Calm, my little child, calm. That's a massive response and a massive reaction to the rudder. Absolutely massive. So I will put a disclaimer in here. It could be down to my pedal settings. There's always the possibility with these things that personal feeling is influenced by pedal settings. I would like to think that that's the case. I would like to think that actually it's my control settings rather than anything to do with the aircraft and the sim. But that does mean that with regards to yaw, once you get beyond significant level of deflection, you really have to be careful about what you're doing. Likewise the speed. As I say, this thing is slippery. Look at that speed. Mind you, we have been throwing it around the sky a little. Now I'm not going to stall it and spin it because that's inappropriate for this sort of aircraft. You know, that's the sort of thing you do with your general aviation aircraft. Not so much an airliner. However, the summary of the handling, well, it's very nice generally speaking. Generally very nice, and I think actually my gut instinct is that it's just a very pleasant airliner to fly. Do I think it's 100% accurate flying characteristics? My guess is probably not, and I just base that purely on that yaw response. Now I appreciate that you know, that's not the general way that the aircraft is flown. However, I can guarantee you that in terms of upset handling and upset recoveries in the sims, the real-life pilot will have practiced all sorts of unusual attitudes with these things. And that does include, let's just get a better view of the mountains before we hit them, that does include upset recoveries from difficult positions like that. So, yeah, my general consensus is that actually that's not the best sort of representation of it. In terms of the handling. Now, what I'm going to do... Oh, odd thing by the way, we haven't got the vertical speed mode engaged, as you can see here. The vertical speed mode here mimics what's on your VSI. So obviously these two instruments are linked. You wouldn't get that normally, and I would strongly suggest it's nothing to do with the aircraft. So let's go down to 5,000 feet. Head towards Sierra, Sierra November. And what we'll do then is we'll do a VOR approach, a non-precision approach. Now I'm looking at the needle on the RMI below, and we're not looking too bad at the minute actually. We're waiting for the head of the needle to come round towards 215. It's coming, it's slow. We're 100 feet too high, which is not good. Now, one of the things I'm going to point out at this juncture is the handling is a little bit woolly, which is what I would expect. I'm going to start our flaps profile. The nose pitch is up, which is what I'd expect. And now we can turn in. And we're looking for a 3-degree descent. Now, a 3-degree profile, we're going to come in at about 140 knots. So a 3-degree profile at 140 knots should bring us in at about 140 knots. That should bring us in at 700 feet per minute rate of descent. Now we're coming around towards the heading. Now you can see we're visual the airfield already. Letting the speed bleed off. As I let the speed bleed off now, I'm going to put some gear down. Next stage of flap as well. Need to make sure that we're on the right heading for the... Pull the tail, push the head, so let's go the far side of the head. This is the instrument I'm using, by the way, this one down here, for a pure VOR approach. Now the pappies say we're high, so we can bring some speed off. We'll start to bring the flaps down as we come. Watch our trim. So as I say, we're going to be, once we get to the pappies and we're happy with the the altitude. We'll be looking for a 700 feet a minute rate of descent. Let the speed get just below 140, a little bit too much there. Bit of oscillation on the trim there, nothing too major. Just waiting for the puppies, and there they come. In we come. Bring the power off, nose down. We're looking for 700 feet a minute, 3-degree glide slope. Even though it's a VOR approach, you still aim for the same sort of numbers as you would do with a an ILS approach. So as I say, 700 feet a minute down should get us down from 1400 feet there or thereabouts. Got a bit of roll trim in, and that's changing considerably as we're doing our approach. Get the pitch trim sorted. If you see the nose bobbing up and down, it's because of the pitch trim. Approach speed 140, going slightly high. Vertical speed's down to 1200, which is a little bit high. Let's arrest that now. Speed's good, about 140. Confirm full flaps 3 green. This thing apparently is quite tough to land, so we'll see how we get on. Slightly off centre line. Nothing too much to worry about. Now you can see the element here is that I'm fully closed on the throttle, 140 knots, this thing is not slowing down.
100, 50, 40, 30, 20, 10.
And down we come. It's got good thrust reversers, I'll give it that. So there we go. That's us. A rather ham-fisted approach and landing, but we are down. So what do we think then, guys? What do we think to all of that? Well, let's break it down into 3 very quick bits for the conclusion. The exterior is gorgeous. There's no other way of looking at it. The complexity of the 3D modelling, the animations, the undercarriage, the flaps, the slats, the entry and exit points, the GPU, just the general appearance of it, stunning. Stunning. I have seen, well, I haven't seen anything else, the likes of which up to this point, in any sim. I think this thing oozes character. It absolutely uses it, and that's one of the key things for me in an aircraft. Is I want to not just fly an aircraft. You know, I want to have something that I enjoy, that has character, that in effect says a little bit about me and what I enjoy flying, or what I enjoy getting out of my simulation as a hobby. So that's the first thing. The second thing is when you jump inside, does it do the same sort of thing? This thing oozes character inside, in my opinion. In terms of texturing, colouring, construction, 3D, instruments, animation, modelling, all that kind of thing, there's a couple of areas which let it down. So this panel down here lets it down with a sort of quality of texturing and building compared to something like this. This is just, that's gorgeous. The model in terms of the instrumentation, fantastic. Not 100% functional, because when you go up to the overhead panel, there's a fair bit of this that doesn't do anything. It doesn't have much impact. So when you go up here for these switches up here, you know, these don't do a great deal. So there's a you know, simple things like the galley switches and whatnot. So there's a good level of functionality, but it's not 100%. And I think the key here is the developers never said it was going to be 100%. So then you get onto the systems modelling and the flying. Well, the flight model is very nice. For me, there's a question mark over the yaw response, because the speed with which it gets over to 70, 80, 90 degrees angle of bank is frightening, even at a moderate pedal input. Now the caveat with that, as I've said before, is it depends on individual control setup, because you can have a control setup that's very mild or tame in terms of controls. Some of them can be very quick to act and ferocious in other respects. So all things told, it can vary depending on your personal control setup. It can also vary depending on your flying style. But I wouldn't have anticipated that half to 2/3 deflection on my rudder pedals would have thrown me to the side and given me a challenge to try and recover without putting that aircraft into some difficulty. So with that in mind, I think the flight modelling is good up to a point. Now obviously I'm not an MD-80 pilot, so I can't tell you if it flies like an MD-80. What I can tell you though is, as a sim aircraft, it handles in the fashion I would expect for this sort of aircraft, barring the yaw. The yaw seems crazy, in my opinion. However, it's not that much of a problem unless you're intending to do aerobatics with this thing. Generally speaking, it flies around very nice, it trims nicely, it's got good stability in the other two axes. Well, actually it's got good stability in all three axes, it's just a little bit feisty with the rudder. But everything else is good. The controls seem to work nicely, the flaps behave correctly as they should do. Systems wise, you can't burn your engines out, so although the indications go roaring off, you can't dump loads of fuel in the engine and set it on fire. So it hasn't got a full fire damage model, for example, with the engines. You can obviously have an impact on it with the normal X-plane inbuilt modelling system, so if you go too fast for the flaps they will snap off and you'll dive into the ground in a flaming fiesta of light and smoke. However, the system's modelling and reality for flying, I would say this thing's about 70% functional. I mean, the obvious ones are the fix, hold and progress pages, which just don't work at all. Nice feature with the aircraft management, it's just a shame it's not accessible unless you've got emergency power on, or you've already got AP or ground, at which point it's a case of why would I want to connect the ground. So there is a little workaround about that, but the developers are aware, and this is one of the key things now, is that the developers have been listening to the forums. So things like the TCAS, which isn't functional, that's not to say it won't change. The developers are listening to the forums, and it's nice actually to see the developers paying attention to those forums and listening, as opposed to just from the posts I've seen, as opposed to just being dismissive. Now the flight mode annunciator panel is not exactly 100% as real life, the autopilot is not exactly 100% as real life, and the FMS is not exactly 100% as in real life. I think there are obviously times when developers have to make concessions based on time, money and ability, and they clearly have made some concessions here. The question mark then comes down to, have the concessions ruined the product? Have they improved the product? Or are they good for the target audience the product is aimed at? Now for me, if you were going for high fidelity ultra realism, this is not the sim for you. If you want to fly something that gives you the feel and sensation of flying that sort of aircraft, this is a good one to have a look at. It's got enough complexity in the systems and enough intrigue and foibles in the systems that you actually have to spend the time to learn to fly the aircraft. You can't just jump in this jet and go, because you will crash it. So there's enough there to make it interesting, and as soon as it becomes interesting, for me that matches the era we're looking at here. The FMS can be used successfully to fly routes, and although I don't know what the situation is with online flying regarding the TCAS, because I don't do a great deal with the virtual airlines, pretty much everything else is there. Because as I say, you can change your arrival airport, you can change the SIDS and stars that you're going through. It's all able to be changed in flight. You can do a direct intercept, for example. Some of the mechanisms for doing it aren't always intuitive, but you know, there is a fairly decent manual with this, which is another point to highlight, that there are so many products out there that either ship with a 600, 700, 800 page FCOM manual, which you're expected to wade through trying to find the basics of how to just get the thing started. Other products will come with half a dozen sheets of paper and a few web links, which is just completely ridiculous. And then there's ones in the middle where you actually get quite a good manual, quite a good set of paperwork, which this is. And I suppose then you move on to the question mark of price. Now this is $60. The upcoming Flight Factor, well, I think it's out now, the Flight Factor 767 is $65. It has a much higher fidelity than this and quite a few more features than this. Now I don't want to get into the scope of comparing the two aircraft, because they're apples and eggs. You know, the 767 is not something that for me is a direct comparable to this. This is short haul, old school, bizarre aircraft. You've got to learn the aircraft and all the stuff around it because of its oddities, its elements that make it interesting. And this is a real interesting aircraft. That's not saying the 767 isn't, but the 767 for me is aimed at a different audience. It's aimed at the high fidelity sim audience, the ones who want it to be as close as it can be to real life. Now, that's $65, this is $60. I actually think for the price that this is quite reasonable. I think maybe it should be a little bit cheaper. You know, but the flip side to that is I don't know what the financial situation is in terms of the aircraft when they're developed, i.e. how much time, money and effort the developer has put into it, because in effect that also reflects the price. As an example, for example, the PMDG stuff, the 777 I think it is $120 odd, and on top of that you'd have to buy P3D, which is $200. So with that in mind, the whole package is very, very expensive. You then look at this and you go, well, maybe in context that this isn't too bad at all. You know, this is a decent sim, a decent aircraft, does do what it says on the tin in my opinion, and hopefully that's left you guys with food for thought. I've hopefully shown you enough of the aircraft that you can at least have a good impression as to what it's all about, and ultimately I think it's quite a decent aircraft. I think it's a very good aircraft, long anticipated, long waited for. Maybe if I was going to be critical of one thing more than anything else, it's management of expectations, because it's quite apparent a few people were not sure what this was going to be when it came out, and there was an anticipation that it might be a study sim. It's not a study sim, but that doesn't mean it's a bad sim. I actually really like this aircraft, and I really enjoy flying it. The fact that the developers are listening to their sort of sales market as well just adds to the fact that there's every possibility, and there's no guarantees, but there's every possibility that this will be developed further. So I suppose it's a case of watch the space for what happens with this aircraft. But in the meantime, I'm enjoying flying it, and I hope you enjoyed the videos. If you did, please don't forget to tick like, share or subscribe, and in the meantime I shall see you soon.